A group of SWAT officers armed with assault rifles surrounded a residential house. They used a battering ram to force open the door. The violent crashing sound jolted the man awake. The man had just woken up when he was confronted by heavily armed SWAT officers. He was pinned to the ground. The police then searched his garage and found printing equipment and nearly 1 million counterfeit $20 bills. This looming man was the mastermind behind a $250 million super counterfeiting operation. The story begins back in 2008. 38-year-old Frank started from scratch and founded a company producing brake pads. Years of relentless high-pressure work had long since drained all his energy. Yet all it brought him was basic financial security. In his eyes, there was an unavoidable fatal flaw in all physical businesses: customer acquisition. To attract new clients, you need marketing, advertising, and a sales team. What follows is endless operational expenses. In the daily grind of internal struggles, he desperately longed to find a shortcut to completely escape this exhausting lifestyle. An absurd yet incredibly tempting idea suddenly took hold in his mind. What if money itself became the product for sale? Wouldn't that eliminate the need to tirelessly search for clients? Following this train of thought, the gray area of counterfeit production quickly came into his view. He scoured the globe for major counterfeit production cases and discovered a startling commonality. Almost all counterfeiters who were caught ultimately failed at the most basic paper stage. The US dollar bills in circulation at the time used a special anti-counterfeiting paper made of cotton linen blend, exclusively supplied by a single US manufacturer. This paper does not show fluorescence under ultraviolet light. The unique cotton linen fibers provide an eerie, pliable texture. Even after thousands of folds, it doesn't easily tear. Trying to obtain this paper through legal channels was simply impossible. Most counterfeiters could only struggle with imitating the paper. Some bleached small denomination bills and reprinted them with larger denominations. Others spent years repeatedly adjusting the fiber ratios of the paper, but the results were never satisfactory. Looking at the neatly organized research materials covering the wall, Frank was thinking, if he could obtain paper with the exact same specifications, that would directly clear the biggest hurdle. At the end of 2008, Frank called the paper supplier Private Investment Consortium Producing Bonds, explaining that he had extremely high requirements for the paper's anti-counterfeiting specifications. It must be the strictest anti-counterfeiting checks. The sales representative on the line immediately perked up with interest. Inquiring in detail about the specific parameter standards, Frank followed the meticulously prepared specification list he had polished repeatedly and explained them one by one. He demanded the paper must be made from a cotton linen blend, contain no fluorescent whitening agents, and pass ultraviolet light inspection smoothly. It also needed to have a reserved custom area for adding a watermark of the company founder's portrait as an anti-counterfeiting security thread under ultraviolet light. It must meet currency-grade security standards. The sales representative didn't show a hint of suspicion. In his view, high-end clients always have all sorts of peculiar custom demands. Soon, the supplier sent a formal quotation. Frank immediately paid the full amount of tens of thousands of dollars, finalized an order for a full container of custom paper. Several months later, the container loaded with paper arrived at the customs port. At this moment, Frank was sitting in his car in the parking lot across from the port, holding binoculars, watching the customs officer's every move and expression, every pause they made. Tensed his nerves. Fortunately, the container passed inspection smoothly and was soon delivered to the warehouse that Frank had rented in advance using a Sheagull company. He and his friend had been waiting there. The friend brought professional radio detection equipment. The two circled the container from the body to the doors to the bottom, conducting a thorough, methodical scan. After confirming there were no issues, they opened the container doors. Inside were neatly stacked cardboard boxes. Frank reached out and opened the frontmost box. The moment his fingertips brushed the paper surface, his anxious heart settled. The unique, large sheet texture fully met expectations. The crisp sound when folded, the fiber grain, the paper weight, every specification met the requirements. Early 2009, Frank spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to purchase a complete set of printing equipment, including offset lithography machines and high-precision cutting machines. In the following days, he repeatedly studied the $20 bill, from its security features to the printing process, reverse engineering each step. It's worth noting that the new $20 bill in circulation at the time was considered the benchmark for global anti-counterfeiting technology. The note was produced using a proprietary intaglio printing process, causing the ink to naturally rise above the paper surface. Running a fingernail over it would reveal a distinct raised texture. The number 20 in the lower corner of the note was printed with special optically variable ink. As the viewing angle shifts, the color naturally transitions from bronze to bright green. Next, Frank's task was to meticulously replicate all the remaining security features with absolute precision. He hired a professional graphic designer under the pretext of needing prop bills for a film shoot, tasking the designer with creating the digital files for the notes template. He demanded that every pattern and every piece of text be perfectly reproduced. At the same time, he also procured various special printing inks through special channels, even though they weren't the official ones, but it became a perfect substitute in terms of color reproduction and optical properties. After entering the adaptation phase, Frank spent every day in the warehouse. He placed the genuine bill and the adapted sample note under a high-powered microscope, aligning and comparing them point by point. He repeatedly adjusted the printing press's pressure parameters, not overlooking any deviation. After 2 full months of repeated adjustments, Frank finally printed a sample note that made him instinctively hold his breath. He held the sample up to a light source. The exclusive watermark appeared clearly and completely. His fingertips traced over the portrait on the bill's surface. The raised texture was almost indistinguishable from the real thing, tilting it slowly under the light. The number 20 in the lower corner of the bill indeed produced a color-shifting effect. He ran a counterfeit detection pen over the bill's surface. The mark ultimately showed a pale yellow color. This was a color reaction triggered only by genuine currency. To verify this counterfeit bill's ability to circulate, Frank drove to a gas station 20 kilometers away. He bought a pack of gum and used this test sample note for payment. After the cashier took the bill, they routinely held it up to the light to check the watermark, then rubbed the bill's surface with their fingers. No abnormalities were detected. Finally, he put the bills into the cash register and gave Frank $9 real change. The moment he walked out of the gas station, holding that stack of real cash, Frank knew in his heart that he had succeeded. But creating convincing counterfeit bills solved only half the problem. The other half, the most dangerous part of the entire chain, and the easiest to expose, was how to safely offload these counterfeit bills and exchange them for freely usable real money. Frank knew that if he personally spent these $20 counterfeit bills at stores, he'd be tracked down by the police within a week. He had to establish a stable distribution channel, and this also meant he had to fully step into that underground criminal world he had never touched before. Frank's first distribution deal was set in a remote parking lot. Waiting to meet him were core members of a local crime syndicate. What these people needed most was precisely this hard-to-trace small cash. At the moment of the meeting, Frank's heart was pounding hard. It felt it would burst from his chest. Yet when he spoke, his voice remained steady and calm. He laid out the terms of the deal on the spot. Counterfeit $20 bills, sold at 30% of their face value. By paying $30,000 in real money, you could get $100 worth of counterfeit bills. The buyers present were full of doubts. They had seen too many so-called high-quality counterfeits that ultimately couldn't even pad basic verification. Frank didn't make many excuses. He directly handed out several sample bills, telling them to test them at various stores. As expected, all samples successfully passed anti-counterfeiting checks. Soon the first deal was successfully closed, followed by a second one, and a third order came after. Over the next 2 years, Frank's underground printing operation maintained 24-hour non-stop operation. Even Frank himself found it incredibly ironic. All the operations used the complete set of business logic that had been refined during his rakepack company days. In just 6 months, the money he earned from this illegal business exceeded the total he made from 10 years of legitimate industry work. By 2012, the U.S. Secret Service and Canadian law enforcement began detecting anomalies in the financial system. Alert signal. Multiple banks have successfully reported numerous counterfeit bills with a denomination of $20. This batch of counterfeit notes has highly consistent production characteristics. According to professional appraisal, their imitation level is extremely high. Conventional verification methods can hardly detect them. Law enforcement is aware that someone is flooding the market with this batch of highly realistic counterfeit bills, yet they have been unable to trace the source. Meanwhile, the creator of these counterfeit bills, Frank, is browsing news reports about this investigation. He knows that law enforcement's focus remains on the counterfeit bills circulating in the market and the street handlers and distribution chain. It simply cannot reach him, hiding behind the printing press. But he also knows that this life on the edge of the law cannot last forever. He begins to plan to completely withdraw after distributing a portion to speed up his exit. Frank starts connecting with a large number of new clients. Most of the buyers he connects with are introduced by people from the black market. In March 2000, inside a cafe in Montreal, Canada, Frank pushed the door open and entered. As he approached the seat, he first quickly scanned the entire interior of the shop. Only after confirming no obvious anomalies did he sit down. The buyer before him looked no different from clients he had worked with before. Yet Frank couldn't shake the feeling something was off. The buyer proposed to Frank to first purchase $100,000 worth of end-of-run currency to test the circulation effectiveness of the goods. Frank nodded in agreement. In his view, a $100,000 transaction carried manageable risk. This was also standard customary practice in the industry. The buyer then added, if the goods quality was truly as solid as rumored, they would place larger follow-up purchase orders. The two quickly finalized all the transaction details. They agreed to complete the handover in the parking lot outside the shopping mall. Afterwards, Frank left the cafe and got into his car. At this moment, he was completely unaware that in a surveillance van not far away, law enforcement officers had already recorded the entire conversation. Time moved to the night of the agreed transaction. Frank was driving a rented SUV. Driving into the shopping mall's parking lot, the counterfeit money was in a duffel bag on the back seat of the vehicle. This transaction he had already completed dozens of times before, but this time, there was a constant sense of unease in the air. He drove around the parking lot twice, checking for all possible risks. But everything within sight appeared completely normal. Then he parked his car next to the buyer's vehicle. At 8:07 p.m., Frank took the backpack handed by the buyer, containing the payment, while handing over the duffel bag with the counterfeit money. After confirming it was correct, the two drove away in opposite directions, leaving the scene. In a surveillance vehicle not far away, law enforcement officers were quietly reporting the situation on site, recording that the goods had been delivered. At the same time, a police helicopter was taking off, tracking Frank's vehicle from the air. Just then, Frank suddenly made a sharp U-turn and headed back. The commander in the surveillance vehicle immediately gave orders. All units maintain a safe tracking distance. After some probing, and finally breathed a sigh of relief, but he never could have imagined that 500 meters above his head, someone was watching his every move with pinpoint accuracy. At 8:47 p.m. that night, Frank drove into a rural residence. Law enforcement immediately photographed this address. By this point, they had gathered sufficient evidence to issue an arrest warrant. In the early morning of May 2012, a fully armed SWAT team raided Frank's residence. Within mere seconds of reaching the door, Frank was pinned firmly to the ground, cold handcuffs locked around his wrists. Law enforcement officers informed him on the spot that he was under arrest for suspected counterfeiting in June 2012. Frank cooperated with law enforcement and led them to a secret storage location outside Montreal. When the storage unit door was opened, everyone present fell into silence. Every single box contained bundles of $20 denomination counterfeit bills. Law enforcement spent several days counting and ultimately confirmed the amount to be around $200 million. In addition, counterfeit printing plates were also seized from the warehouse. Complete set of production technical parameters. July 2012. The Quebec Superior Court heard the case. Frank pleaded guilty to all charges in court. Given his full cooperation with law enforcement throughout, all assisting police in recovering a total of $200 million in counterfeit bills, and since he counterfeited US dollars and did not harm Canada's own currency system, the judge ultimately ruled that his accumulated sentence would offset all imprisonment, requiring only 6 more weeks of incarceration. And today's Frank has long shed his former shady identity. The expertise that once made him unrivaled in the field of counterfeit production and that near-obsessive attention to detail have now become his core competencies. He uses these skills to teach financial institutions how to identify, prevent, and catch those operating on the edge of the law. The counterfeit producers